Under the shroud of a humid Mississippi night of August 28, 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, was dragged from his great-uncle's home late at night by two armed men, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Millam. Their claim? That Emmett, a black teenager unfamiliar with the suffocating racism of the Jim Crow South, had supposedly made an inappropriate remark to Bryant's wife, Carolyn, a white woman. Emmett's great-uncle, Mose Wright, watched helplessly as the men threatened him with violence before taking the boy. Their faces showed the anger in them, their actions well planned. They promised to teach him a lesson. What followed was a horror that the world would struggle to comprehend. Hours turned into days before Emmett's lifeless body was found in the Tallahatchie River, weighed down with a 75-pound fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. His face was unrecognizable, mutilated beyond belief. Yet, the events leading up to his death and the men's motivations would soon expose a deeper, more sad and unbelievable reality about racial violence in America. What exactly had Emmett done? And why did a single alleged act, one that remains disputed to this day, lead to such a barbaric fate? As the trial began, the nation's eyes turned toward Mississippi, where the jury would decide not only the fate of Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam but also the fragile definition of justice in a deeply segregated society. Emmett Till was born on July 25, 1941, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the only child of Mamie Carthen Till, a hardworking single mother who had high hopes for her son. Emmett, known to family and friends as Bobo, was a lively and outgoing 14-year-old. He loved telling jokes, playing with friends, and wearing sharp clothes. He had a stutter due to a childhood illness, but he often used humor to overcome it, making everyone around him feel at ease. Life in Chicago gave Emmett opportunities that were rare for many black families living in the South. While racism still existed, the segregation laws of the South, known as Jim Crow, did not dictate daily life in the same way. Chicago offered Emmett a sense of freedom, and he grew up in a close-knit neighborhood surrounded by family and friends who adored him. In the summer of 1955, Emmett was excited about visiting family in Money, Mississippi. His great-uncle, Mose Wright, had invited him to spend time there and help with farm work. It was a chance for Emmett to see life outside the city and spend time with his cousins. Mamie was hesitant to let him go. She understood the dangers of the South, where strict racial laws and customs made life for black people precarious. Before Emmett left, she gave him a serious talk. "Be careful," she said. "Say yes, sir, and no, ma'am. Don't look white people in the eye. And don't do anything that might seem disrespectful." Emmett assured her he would be fine. He packed his best clothes and boarded the train, excited for the adventure ahead. When he arrived in Mississippi, he was greeted warmly by his great-uncle Mose, a farmer and preacher who was respected in the community. Mose lived in a small house surrounded by cotton fields, and for Emmett, it was a completely new environment. Emmett quickly bonded with his cousins. His city style, jokes, and stories about life in Chicago made him stand out. He was confident and full of energy, which impressed and entertained the people around him. However, his behavior, so normal in Chicago, was different from what was expected in the South. Mose Wright, a quiet man who had spent his life navigating the harsh realities of Mississippi, kept a watchful eye on his nephew. He knew how quickly things could go wrong. In this part of the country, a minor misunderstanding or an innocent action could lead to serious consequences for a black boy. Emmett, however, didn't fully understand the weight of these unspoken rules. He was enjoying his time in Mississippi, unaware that his outgoing personality and northern upbringing might put him at risk. As he laughed and played with his cousins, Mose likely worried about how his nephew's confidence might be perceived in a place where racial tensions were always close to the surface. The visit was shaping up to be memorable, but Mose couldn't shake a feeling of unease. He had taken responsibility for Emmett, and he knew the dangers lurking in the world outside their small home. Still, life went on as usual, with no sign of what was about to happen. The events of that summer would take a terrible turn, one that nobody could never have anticipated. On August 24, 1955, Emmett Till and a group of cousins and friends went to Bryant's grocery and meat market in Money, Mississippi. The store was a modest structure frequented by black sharecroppers in the area, owned and operated by Roy and Carolyn Bryant, a white couple. Emmett, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, entered the store to purchase candy. What happened inside is a matter of dispute. Carolyn Bryant later claimed that Emmett made an advance toward her, including whistling and grabbing her hand, though these allegations were later recanted by Bryant herself decades after the events. Witnesses outside the store recalled Emmett speaking in a lighthearted, playful manner, mentioning his life in Chicago, which may have been misinterpreted. In the context of the Jim Crow South, such actions, whether real or imagined, were viewed as an affront to the rigid racial hierarchy. The power dynamics were stark. White individuals wielded near-absolute authority, both socially and legally, over black individuals. For a black teenager to interact in such a manner with a white woman was considered a dangerous breach of social norms. Carolyn Bryant left the encounter agitated, and word of the incident spread quickly through the small, tightly knit community. By the time Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, returned home, he was incensed. Over the next few days, Roy and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, fueled their anger, claiming they needed to defend Carolyn's honor and set an example. In the early hours of August 28, 1955, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam drove to the home of Emmett's great-uncle, Mose Wright, where Emmett was staying. The house was modest and isolated, surrounded by cotton fields. The men arrived armed with a flashlight and a pistol, banging loudly on the door. Mose Wright, a 64-year-old preacher, cautiously opened the door to face the two white men. Bryant and Millam demanded to see the boy from Chicago. Despite Mose's protests, they entered the home, shining their flashlight into the small, dimly lit rooms until they found Emmett asleep in a bed with his cousins. The men roused Emmett and ordered him to get dressed. Mose Wright and his wife, Elizabeth, pleaded with them to leave the boy alone. Mose even offered them money in exchange for Emmett's safety. The men dismissed his pleas, telling the family they only intended to teach the boy a lesson. Emmett was taken outside and forced into the back of their truck. Several others were reportedly present, including a man who remained in the vehicle and may have assisted in the abduction. Before driving away, Bryant and Millam warned Mose and his family to remain silent about what they had witnessed. As the truck disappeared into the dark Mississippi night, Mose and his family were left in shock and fear. They knew the risks of challenging white men in the deeply segregated South and were powerless to intervene. The silence that followed in the house was heavy, broken only by whispered prayers for Emmett's. The following morning they reported to the police, but those prayers would go unanswered. When Emmett Till's body was found in the Tallahatchie River on August 31, 1955, it bore the unmistakable marks of horrifying violence. He had been beaten so severely that his face was swollen beyond recognition. His right eye was gouged out, his teeth knocked loose, and the bridge of his nose shattered. A bullet hole above his right ear told of the final act of brutality. His skull showed fractures consistent with heavy blows, and his body bore signs of torture. To ensure his remains would sink, a 75-pound cotton gin fan was fastened to his neck with barbed wire, a cruel detail that spoke to the calculated nature of his murder. 3 days after Emmett's abduction, a local boy fishing in the Tallahatchie River saw the bloated remains of a body caught in the weeds near the shore. What they pulled from the water was horrifying. Emmett's body was barely intact, with his flesh discolored and waterlogged after days in the river. News of the discovery spread quickly, but the sheriff's office wanted the ordeal over as soon as possible. They demanded a swift burial, treating Emmett's body as an inconvenience rather than evidence of a crime. When Mamie Till was informed her son had been found, her grief was overwhelming. Despite the distance, she refused to let her son's body be buried in Mississippi. She demanded its return to Chicago, knowing that her community, and the world, needed to see what had been done to her child. The journey north was a somber one. Emmett's remains were placed in a pine box and shipped back by train. When the casket arrived in Chicago, Mamie braced herself for what she was about to see. Even prepared, nothing could have lessened the blow. She opened the casket and was met with a vision of inhuman cruelty. Mamie later described how she carefully examined her son, noting every mark and injury: the crushed skull, the deep wounds, the broken jaw. Though her heart ached, Mamie made an extraordinary decision, one born of both despair and determination. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy." Mamie Till's words reverberated through history. She demanded an open-casket funeral, refusing to let the brutality inflicted on her son be hidden or sanitized. Thousands of mourners lined up for hours to pay their respects. They wept openly as they filed past the casket, staring in shock and disbelief at Emmett's disfigured face. Many left the church trembling, unable to fathom the depths of hate that could drive such an act. The images of Emmett's mutilated body were published in Jet magazine and other black publications, reaching households across America and beyond. For countless people, seeing those photographs was a turning point. It laid bare the everyday terror black Americans faced in the Jim Crow South and revealed, with unflinching clarity, the cost of racism. The sorrow in Chicago was mirrored by outrage across the nation. Communities held rallies, protests, and vigils. Civil rights leaders seized the moment to draw attention to the urgency of their cause. Mamie Till, despite her grief, stood strong and gave interviews, her voice shaking with pain but unwavering in resolve. Emmett's death was not just a tragedy, it was a call to action. Yet, for all the national outrage, Mississippi's justice system would soon make clear where it stood. What followed in the courtroom was another chapter in a story of injustice that had already claimed far too much. The trial of Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam unfolded in a setting where racial dynamics and the structure of the legal system were heavily skewed. The jury that was selected to deliberate on the fate of the two white men accused of murdering Emmett Till was composed entirely of white men. In 1950s Mississippi, the concept of a jury of one's peers was hollow for African Americans. Black men and women were systematically excluded from juries, a practice rooted in the long history of segregation and racial discrimination that defined life in the South. The jury, made up of 12 white men, sat in judgment of a case that directly involved the life of a black child, but none of the jurors could relate to Emmett, his family, or the racial tensions that formed the backdrop of the crime. There was no impartiality. The all-white jury represented the very system that had oppressed black Americans for generations. In the courtroom, the reality of this racial imbalance was palpable. Emmett, a young black boy from Chicago, had been beaten, shot, and disposed of by two white men. Yet, despite the shocking nature of the crime, the jury was not concerned with the brutal facts. The system they represented was one in which the lives of black people were not valued equally, and the white men in the courtroom were not at risk regardless of the evidence. As the trial continued, it became increasingly clear that the deck had been stacked in favor of the accused. While the prosecution presented testimony that should have led to a conviction, it was evident that the all-white jury would not be swayed by logic or morality. Their decision was likely never in doubt. After only an hour of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty, a decision that, in the eyes of many, was a foregone conclusion from the start. The failure of the justice system to hold Bryant and Millam accountable highlighted the deeply entrenched racial inequality that governed not only the courts but society itself. The all-white jury's decision to acquit was not just a miscarriage of justice for Emmett Till. It was a stark reminder of how the legal system was designed to protect white supremacy. And in that courtroom, the voices of black Americans were silenced, their right to have a say in the justice system stripped away by the very people who had perpetuated their oppression. After their acquittal, Bryant and Millam celebrated openly. A party was held in their honor, complete with laughter, drinking, and a sense of victory. The brutal murder of Emmett Till, in their eyes, was not a crime but an act they felt justified in committing. For Mamie Till and those who had fought for Emmett's justice, the verdict was devastating. The pain of losing her son was compounded by the cold reality that the system had failed him completely. Yet, even in this moment of despair, Mamie resolved to continue her fight, knowing that the truth of what had happened in Mississippi needed to be shared. The trial, with its blatant miscarriage of justice, sparked outrage far beyond the segregated South. The images of Emmett's mutilated body and the stories of the trial spread across the country and beyond. Protests erupted, civil rights leaders mobilized, and the world began to take notice of the deep injustices faced by Black Americans. The acquittal of Bryant and Milam became a rallying point for the burgeoning civil rights movement. Emmett's name was invoked at rallies and marches, his story a reminder of the brutality that racism could inflict. While the trial did not bring justice for Emmett Till, it ignited a fire that could not be extinguished, forcing a nation to confront its conscience and sparking a movement that demanded change. Emmett Till's death did more than just shock the nation. It became a catalyst for the civil rights movement, a defining moment that propelled the fight for justice into the national spotlight. Before Emmett, the injustice faced by Black Americans in the South was widespread, but his brutal murder and the subsequent trial highlighted the extreme racial inequality that still permeated every facet of American life. The image of his mutilated body, spread across newspapers and in the minds of anyone who saw it, became a symbol of the horror that so many Black families lived with daily, but it also became a powerful motivator for change. One of the most immediate impacts of Emmett's murder was the fire it lit in the hearts of Black Americans and those sympathetic to their cause. Just months later, in December 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, a small act of defiance that sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Many saw her refusal as a direct continuation of the struggle for justice that Emmett's death had exposed. In fact, the two stories are inextricably linked, as Emmett's death had already shown the world what was at stake for Black people in the fight for equality. The impact of Emmett's murder also reached beyond the Black community. People of all races across the United States, and even internationally, began to understand the depths of racial injustice in the South. Emmett's case and the failure of the justice system to hold anyone accountable for his murder became a rallying cry for civil rights activists, demanding an end to the systemic racism that allowed such tragedies to occur. But the long-term effects of Emmett's death didn't end with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. His story has remained a touchstone for conversations about racial inequality, serving as a painful reminder of the lengths to which some would go to maintain a system of white supremacy. In recent years, Emmett Till's legacy has continued to influence the conversation on racial justice, with new developments emerging that highlight how much remains unresolved. One such development came in 2022, when a warrant for the arrest of Carolyn Bryant Donham, the woman whose accusation against Emmett Till sparked his abduction and murder, was discovered. The warrant, which had never been served, prompted new calls for justice and the reopening of the case. It was a stark reminder that, even though many years had passed, the fight for justice for Emmett Till was far from over. Many still feel that Bryant should be held accountable for her role in his death, and her legacy has remained a point of contention in the ongoing struggle for justice. Emmett Till's story has remained a powerful symbol of racial injustice, a constant reminder of the need for change. It is a reminder that the fight for equality is not confined to one moment in time or one group of people, but a continuing battle that transcends generations. Till's death, his mother's decision to have an open-casket funeral, and the subsequent trial and its outcome have all contributed to shaping the civil rights movement and the continued push for racial justice in America. His story will forever be etched into the history of the fight for civil rights, a somber yet undeniable call for change that endures to this day. The tragic events surrounding Emmett Till's death are still within living memory, a stark reminder that we are not far removed from a time when racial hatred and violence were not only prevalent but sanctioned. It's hard to grasp that it has been less than a century since this unspeakable crime took place. Yet, despite the progress that has been made, the systems of racism and inequality that led to Emmett's murder continue to persist, albeit in more insidious and often less visible forms. While the blatant racial violence that characterized the Jim Crow era may have lessened, we now find ourselves facing the more subtle, but equally destructive systems of systemic racism. This new method of racism isn't as easily identifiable. It doesn't always manifest in violent, overt acts of hate, but instead operates in policies, practices, and everyday interactions that marginalize Black people and other people of color. Whether it's through disparities in education, housing, healthcare, or the criminal justice system, these systems continue to uphold the same structures of racial inequality that allowed Emmett Till's murder to go unpunished for so long. This isn't just a relic of the past. It's a present-day reality that demands attention and action. How do we combat this form of racism? The fight is not over, and it requires continued engagement from everyone, regardless of race. It is up to each of us to challenge systems of oppression, speak out against injustice, and support policies and movements that advocate for racial equity. Emmett Till's story serves as a reminder of the cost of silence, and of the need for each generation to pick up the mantle of those who fought before them. In honor of Emmett Till's legacy, what can we do today? Supporting organizations that advocate for racial justice, participating in community efforts, and even educating ourselves and others about the ongoing struggles for equality are just a few ways we can contribute to the cause. You can visit memorials dedicated to Emmett Till, such as the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Mississippi, which helps keep his memory and the fight for justice alive. Every act of remembrance, every fight for justice, brings us one step closer to the world Emmett's mother dreamed of, a world where such a tragedy would never happen again. How do you think Emmett Till's story continues to shape the fight for racial equality today? His legacy is not only about looking back at the injustice of his death, but also about propelling us forward into action. The question remains, what will we do to ensure that Emmett's death was not in vain, and that his story inspires change for the better? The tragic and unresolved nature of his death forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own society. How much longer can we ignore the legacy of such injustices? What steps are we taking to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again? Emmett Till's death calls on us all to keep pushing for a world where justice isn't delayed and accountability is upheld. The struggle for racial equality is ongoing. Emmett's story demands that we not only remember but actively work to make lasting change. Reflect on the impact his story had and continues to have on the fight for justice. Share this video with others and start conversations around the topic. If you found this story meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content that explores history, justice, and the fight for equality. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive. Let's continue to honor Emmett's legacy by ensuring his story inspires us to keep striving for a better, more